All right. Hey, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. I did some testing on my settings, and I've adjusted some things. So I'm trying something different today. I have a new setup. I hope it sounds better. I'm hoping it sounds better. I'm hoping it sounds nicer for everybody. So let's see. I'm very excited, man. I'm very excited. I went and signed papers for the podcasting space today. So that is going to be materializing over the next couple of weeks as I get my stuff moved out of where I'm at and get all my things moved over there and set up the podcasting studio. So I'm going to try and make sure that I still get a bunch of shows in there. I hadn't really thought about like how many shows I was going to try and do, but now that I've been doing it, I'm thinking I want to do a minimum of 2 a week, and I'd like to aim for more than 2 a week if possible. So that's what I'm going for. So I'm very excited about having a space and about being in a place where I'm going to be able to set up. Well, so like one of the things that's been a challenge for me is that I basically have been doing this on the what's the word I'm looking for? I have been doing this in a way that is not permanent. I've been moving things around. Every time I'd record, I'd set things up, tear things down, move things around, right? So now with the podcasting space, I'll be able to just set everything up and just leave it set up. Right? Like that's actually going to be of tremendous benefit to be able to just have things set up in a place where I can use them. So I'm very much looking forward to moving into a space. Hopefully, once I move into that space, it's going to allow me to get into a rhythm that allows me to do more of these podcasts on a more regular, more frequent basis to keep everybody entertained and enlightened and to, at the same time, make it possible to do life around that as well. See, that's the other thing, too, is I have the greatest hopes and dreams for this podcast. I got to find some sponsors. Simply Safe. Call me Simply Safe. All right, so one of the things that I wanted to talk about was why I love living in Colorado. Part of the reason I love living in Colorado is because I love the outdoors and camping. And Colorado is excellent for that, right? Like when it comes to places to go camp, we got a lot of places to go camping. And I have a few of my favorites. I'm not going to tell you where they are. It's kind of like my favorite fishing hole. If I told you where they were, everybody would go there and then it would ruin it, right? So I have a couple places that are my favorites that I've been camping since I was a Boy Scout way back in the day. And it's not just me that loves the outdoors, right? We have a whole entire state full of people who love the outdoors. That's for certain. The next one is that we mostly have great weather. It's subject to vary. It sometimes changes rapidly, but for the most part, Colorado has pretty great weather. Good part of the year, we're actually blessed to have very good weather here, right? So, which brings me to my next point, which is that we get just enough of each season. Just enough of each season to make it really good. Right? You get just enough winter to make you appreciate summer. You get just enough summer to make you appreciate everything else. It's great. Colorado is really good like that. Coloradans are really open-minded about a lot of things. Just generally speaking, there's, in an earlier episode, I mentioned about how we believe in a different kind of freedom here. It kind of goes back to that. Like, we're just really open-minded about letting people do their thing and live their life and not messing with people unless they're messing with other people. Right? I think that goes back to when this was the Wild West and you really had to decide what you wanted to get on somebody about when it was the community that had to police that person. So I think somehow that still kind of translates and still exists in how Coloradans think, but I'm very glad for that. We're more prepared than other places. Coloradans are just in general a lot more prepared than a lot of people in a lot of different places. So, for instance, a lot of people in Colorado have camping gear. A lot of people have cold weather gear. A lot of people have shovels and all the things, the accoutrement, if you will, that are associated with having to deal with winter and endure winter in Colorado, because it doesn't get that bad that often. But when it gets bad, you need to be prepared. Like, you have to have the right stuff or you're kind of sucking. You're kind of hating it, right? Coloradans are very prepared in that respect, way more so than a lot of people in a lot of different places. And then, one of my favorites is that we have the most insane marijuana trade on the planet of Earth. I think the funniest part is that we eclipsed Amsterdam just a few years after we went full-blown legal. And now we make them look tiny compared to our marijuana industry. The next one, we just decriminalized mushrooms in Denver. That's pretty cool. And that goes back to that whole being open-minded thing, right? One of the things that I really look forward to with the decriminalization of mushrooms is I believe that we can implement that in a way that is also successful and is also peaceful and is also a net positive on the community and not a net negative. I'm a firm believer that we can do that. And my next one is Coloradans love to have fun. Man, they love to have fun. They love to party. They love to go to concerts and sporting events. We got every kind of thing here. All the major artists come here except for a few. Every once in a while, there's a couple really big, like the Rolling Stones usually don't hit Denver. Sometimes U2 skips us and stuff like that. But beyond that, practically every artist eventually comes to Denver. And as a matter of fact, a lot of artists routinely stop in Denver. So Denver's really great for entertainment and sports. We got all that stuff, right? So that's pretty great. And then the other thing that makes living in Colorado pretty great is that we have practically every diversion known to man here. Right? We got the indoor skydiving thing. We got Water World, which is a pretty decent water park, right? Water World is the only caveat about Water World is you got to be careful at Water World, man. It's easy to mess yourself up at Waterworld. I have gone there a couple of times and messed myself up. So as much as I like Waterworld, you got to be careful. Yeah, so we have practically everything that you could possibly want to do here. We have fine dining. We have mediocre dining. We have, if you want to shoot machine guns, you can go see Mel down at the Dragon Man's. We have everything that you could possibly want to do. Colorado is magnificent like that. So living here has its upsides, has its perks. The only downside that has been rough lately is that Colorado has gotten a lot more expensive in the last couple of years. And I think that that's because it's a highly desirable place to live. And a lot of people have moved to Colorado in an attempt to get in on that, right? To get their little stake, their little claim on that piece of gold that is Colorado living. One of the things that I want to make sure doesn't happen is I don't want to lose all the things that makes Colorado awesome to transplants. If you want to move to Colorado, you got to be open-minded. You got to be willing to live and let live. You got to be cool, people. Can you be cool? Well, then you can live here. If you can't be cool, you got to go. Because that's how we roll, man. We're just cool. We're cooler than the average people. That's how that is. I'm really loving how my microphone is sounding right now. It's you'll never find as long as you live someone who'll care for you the way I do. Yeah. My microphone sounds nice. I'm loving that. I think I like these changes. I got a new pop filter. I think it's working great. Like the buh. Man, sounds clean, right? You're the ones listening to it. You tell me. It sounds clean. It sounds nice. Yeah. The tube preamp that I'm using, I think I finally figured out the magic settings to get the action on it that I need, man. Because I'm really loving this sound a lot more than any of the podcasts I've done up to this point. I think I finally found the secret. Oh, man, I was just sitting here and I was just... I'm thoroughly ridiculous right now, right? I'm sitting here thinking to myself, sweet. And then, of course, my ridiculous brain pops in. Dude, what's mine say? Dude. What's mine say? Sweet. I love that movie, man. It's one of those films where it's so bad it's good, right? It's one of those films where it's so ridiculous that it's hilarious. Yeah. And in case you've been living in a cave your whole life, I'm talking about Dude, Where's My Car? Right? If you've never seen Dude, Where's My Car? Well, I assure you that it's 2 hours you'll never get back, but it has some moments in it. It has moments that'll stick with you for the rest of your life. Like, and then, and then. Oh, man. I'm ridiculous. All right. But I digress. I had written down a bunch more show notes since I last did my recording, and I listened to the opening part of this. I'm really digging on the changes that I've made to my microphone. It sounds really nice. I hope that you guys agree. I wanted to move on to my next somewhat serious topic of the day. I don't want this to turn into some science denier conversation about what I'm about to say, because it has nothing to do with denying science. What I'm going to say is that we give science and scientists too much credit for knowing more than they do, or for believing that their models and their predictions are so infallible that they're absolutely certain. They're completely certain that everything that they say is just the truth, and they really do believe it, man. But a lot of scientists have been wrong about a lot of predictions. And a lot of those predictions have caused a lot of stress in the world, man. And there's no fine for being wrong, right? You can say the craziest, most conjectural nonsense and here's what I want to say about it, okay? So, because I don't want this to be a science denial, I'm using quote fingers right now. You can't see it, my science denial. You heard my quote fingers right there. That's not what this is. What I want to say is that when science is conducted these days, very often there's a lot of junk science with little or no correlation or experiment replication to back up the findings of the initial scientific experiment. So oftentimes, when science arrives at an answer, very often it wasn't really correlated or duplicated in other experiments, because there's kind of a lack of desire in the scientific community to follow up somebody else's research and run an experiment to see if they're full of crap or not, right? That is not going on the way that it once did, or the way that it should go on, right? Because we should question everything that somebody says. Because very often the initial answers that come out in any scientific subject change a lot over the course of the research or the lifetime of that subject, right? So whatever they thought they knew, oftentimes they change that. And we tend to give science a little too much of our own faith or credit in knowing everything. They just don't. They just don't, man. So another thing that is kind of shamsky, funny smelling about science is that there are a lot of papers that are rubber stamped through the scientific process, right? So a lot of papers are submitted for peer review to scientific journals and things like this. And those papers very oftentimes, and to some respect, their philosophy is probably, let's let the people decide. We'll put this in the journal. If it has merit or not, we'll just put it in the journal. We'll let the people decide if it has merit, right? I don't actually have a beef with that. But what seems to come out of the other side of that is not really good science. Everybody reads it. Everybody comes to the conclusion that was concluded by that person. Nobody replicates or duplicates it. And then they just move on as though that one finding or that one small study is now fact. It's just a settled thing, right? If we're to be honest about it, that's just not the reality of it. There are a lot of things that humanity does not know. Pure and simple, let me put it another way. There's just a whole lot of shit we don't know, people. That's truth. That is the honest to God's truth. There are a lot of things that we don't know. There's a lot of things that we speculate on. There's a lot of things that science believes that it knows, but is subject to change. Everything in science has an asterisk next to it that says, at this point in time. At this point in time, we believe. A very good example of that is where the earth is in the center and everything goes around the earth. We now, of course, know that that's not true. But they would have killed you 300, 400, 500 years ago for saying any kind of heresy that the entire universe did not spin about the earth. So it's just sort of proof that zeitgeist, or the prevailing thought within the world and the community, is a thing. Science and what scientists know are directly linked to the zeitgeist of the day. And Everything is based relativistically to that, to whatever the zeitgeist is. I'm just going to summarize to say, don't believe everything that science tells you, right? Sometimes they're kind of full of shit. Sometimes the science that they're trying to sell you serves an agenda. And that's another thing too, is that oftentimes scientific findings side with the provider of the funding for the research. So if somebody wants to find out that cigarettes are not bad for you, Big Tobacco will sponsor different research. And when something comes out that looks less damning or less bad, let's go with that one. That is exactly how you can cherry pick the results of any sort of experiment to get the results that you're looking for. That's my beef with what's been going on with marijuana research for the past 50 years. The government itself has policies that are counter to each other. Like, for instance, they ran the medical marijuana program back in like 1971 or something like that. And a few people were able to register to get medical marijuana. And to this day, they still receive medical marijuana from the government. That perfectly is an example of how can you provide this for somebody while simultaneously denying it for everybody else and saying that, oh, well, he was grandfathered in to this experiment, and so therefore we're obligated. And it's like, well, if it has any medicinal value at all, then it can't be on Schedule 1. Which is one of the things that I do not understand about the current scheduling of marijuana. And I know that they're trying to change this in Washington right now, but how can you have drugs that are in clinical medicinal trials that have been accepted by the FDA for clinical trials and simultaneously say that it has a very high addiction substance abuse rate and has zero value as a medicinal? Is completely incongruent. That doesn't make sense. So I know that right now they're working in Washington to try and kind of figure that out. And interestingly enough, President Trump has kind of come out neutral on the whole thing, and neutral in a positive way. He said, I'll basically follow the recommendations of the Attorney General. And they've got a new Attorney General who seems to be a little bit less, he doesn't have the same philosophies about marijuana that Jeff Sessions did. Thank goodness. Thank goodness. When he announced that Jeff Sessions was going to be the Attorney General, I was just like, you gotta be kidding me, man. And because his marijuana policy was from 1965. His philosophy about marijuana, like, for instance, he thought the KKK was a pretty good group until he found out they smoked marijuana. I kid you not, people. So we can't have it. Yeah, we couldn't have it. So I was really glad when Jeff Sessions finally just got handed his hat and got sent out the door, because his marijuana policy was so outdated and moving backwards. And the idea that we're going to stop this freight train rolling now, you've got too many states that have gone too far, and they've set up entire industries around this. We've employed thousands of people. We're collecting millions of tax dollars, right? We can't stop this train now. That's ridiculous. And Jeff Sessions, he couldn't let it go, which goes back to being a computer and being programmed. Jeff Sessions was a computer that was programmed to hate marijuana, and he also had garbage in, garbage out. He had bad information going in, and it was causing him to make poor decisions and execute poorly on what marijuana really is and what it does and what it's about. I've been watching a really great thing on Netflix. It's called Grass is Greener. It is a great documentary about sort of the history of marijuana and how it came up alongside jazz, and how marijuana laws were brought online to make an easy way to discriminate against anybody that you didn't like. That whether it be black people or Mexican people or white people that were counterculture, white people that thought that the government didn't actually know everything and weren't for the war and stuff like that, they were victims of the war on weed too. Because it was just so easy. It was almost like a ready-made excuse to just hassle anybody. And then the other side of that was that the effect of propaganda that came out during that era from the likes of Harry J. Anslinger, who was the father of the weed propaganda movement, like with reefer madness and everything, that stuff devastated the reputation of marijuana. And he talks about in this documentary, I highly recommend that you guys watch it, by the way. He talks about in this documentary how they released all these false stories about marijuana psychosis and how people had gotten high on marijuana and then killed their families. And it was the most insane, ridiculous stuff. You got to understand that in a world where all the newspapers were really simple, nobody questioned anything back then, right? My point is that it was much easier to control the narrative. And when you released a negative story about marijuana or marijuana psychosis, it would run in every newspaper across the nation. It would run on all the radio stations, and it would get transmitted to the entire masses. People were far more likely to believe that stuff because they were, for lack of a better word, it was simpler and more Puritan. We had a much simpler society back then. And that's the other thing that I love about the documentary is that they go on to talk about there was a lot of research that really showed that all that was nonsense and that there really wasn't a whole lot of reason to hate on marijuana the way that they did. They even talk about the fact that they changed its name from cannabis to marijuana because marijuana sounded distinctly more Mexican and it made it sound more evil. It's just proof that the links that they'll go to make something bad. So Colorado banned it in 1917. Couldn't believe that. That blew my mind. And especially when you see all those old bottles from back in the day, all the old medicine bottles that said like heroin and cocaine, like once upon a time, we were pretty convinced that all of those things were legitimate medicines and nobody had a problem with it, right? So it's kind of ridiculous. But definitely, if you get a chance, watch Grass is Greener on Netflix. Man, it's a great documentary. It shows a great look into the life cycle of marijuana legalization. I'm only like halfway through it or something like that, less than halfway through it. So I don't know how it ends exactly, but it's been fascinating so far. My next topic of discussion, I was always fascinated by sound and sound equipment, and I always loved music. And that is one of the reasons that I'm doing this podcast. It is adjacent to sound and doing sound. I'm a huge fan of all things sound, right? So as a latchkey kid, I grew up and I would spend my afternoons awaiting the return of my single mom from her job. To pass the time, I would play her records in the living room on the stereo. And my mom had the best record collection. She had all the best stuff that was out at the time. And that would have been about 1976. Right, 1976, 1977, 78. You guys might not be from that era, or maybe you are, but there was a lot of really great music in that era. And I think that that's part of the reason that a lot of that music is sort of coming back around again in an everything old is new again sort of fashion. Because good music endures the test of time. Any good song, and this is the coolest thing, you can pull out any good song from any era and play it, and that is still a good song to this day, man. To this day. That's the beauty of doing something that's really great, is that it's timeless. It might reflect or encapsulate a particular time, but the music itself and the quality of it, that's timeless. And that's one of the beautiful things that I love about music, right? I consider that childhood of playing my mom's records to be the foundation of my love for music. As I got older, I became interested in electronics, and around 14, I moved into this neighborhood where I was about to go to my future high school. Hip hop was very up and coming at that time. That was when the Beastie Boys were hitting, and Run DMC and Kool Moe Dee and Ice-T and all those characters were. But when I was in junior high school, yeah, Run DMC, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, people like that. Those were all the up and coming people, right? I would make mixtapes on my stepfather's stereo. He had a dual cassette deck tape player, and I would make compilations and mixtapes, right? And I didn't have the money to buy a lot of music, and we all kind of relied on dubbing to get the most music for your dollar that we could throughout the years, especially back then, right? When I didn't have a lot of money to go out and buy records, but I could afford blank tapes, and I knew how to record tapes, right? And so that was the other thing. Recording tapes for yourself is not actually illegal. Recording them and selling them to other people, that's the part that's illegal, right? That's the part that's copyright infringement. But if I'm just making copies for myself for my own personal use, it's actually not illegal. So yeah, that was how I got my start. And then as I got a little bit older, I started doing stuff with people's car stereos. And then when I went into the Army, I ended up buying a ridiculous stereo that I had in my room. When I got out of the Army, I started to become a fan of sound equipment in bars and clubs. That was what led me into being an actual real sound man. So that was how I ended up going down the path towards being a sound man, right? It was all of those things. One of the things that I really loved about being a sound man was what I call outside the context, where you would get to hear people's voices and their accents. So I love people's voices. I love to hear people's voices. I love to hear their accents. If they're British or they're Indian, they're Eskimo, they're a hardcore Bostonian, or they're from the East Coast, or they're Irish. I love Aussies and New Zealanders, or they're German. I love all kinds of accents, and that's a result of having been a sound man for so long, right? I love when I get to hear an artist's voice outside of the context of their record or album. So my example was one day I had the distinct pleasure of being the van driver up at Red Rocks. The van driver, in case you don't know, the back road up Red Rocks is incredibly steep. So if you have to walk it, like, you'll be gassing, especially if you're not from here, you'll be gassing by the time you get up to the backstage door. So we have a van that goes up and down, and it takes artists up and down and stuff like that. And so that day that I was driving, Beck was here, and Beck was performing at Red Rocks. So I got down to the bottom, right, and I pick up Beck. And it was the coolest thing because as we're driving up, he's talking to his people in the back seat, and I'm getting to hear his voice and just hear him talk, right? And he sounds, of course, his voice sounds exactly like the albums, but I was finally getting to hear it outside the context of his songs, right? I was finally getting to hear just his voice outside of his records, but getting to hear it in person. And as a sound man, I thought that was just really, really cool, right? I really love those moments. It was cool hearing him just talk. I could listen to artists just talk because to hear them talk out of the context of their album is really cool. I love that. Another one that I got to do was in 2000, I did a graduation ceremony at CU up in Boulder. And Neil Diamond did the national anthem for that one. I remember I had gone to the truck to park the truck, and then I was walking back in, and at that moment, there's old Neil Diamond on the microphone. He's like, "Oh, say, can you see?" Right? And it was so funny because as I was walking in, I was like, wow, man, that sounds just like Neil Diamond. When I looked at the cat on stage, I didn't think it was him. And then when he was done, he came over to the mixing console, and sure enough, of course it was him. Who else would it be, right? And it was really crazy to hear Neil Diamond's voice outside the context of his music, but it was also a very cool moment, right? It was cool to do that. On occasion, I've done a couple of gigs where the artist is just ridiculously famous, but the setting is very intimate. When I did that gig with Neil Diamond, there was 4 of us. There was Neil. He had an assistant guy who was his sound person, his traveling sound guy. And then there was one other guy from where I was working and me. And that was it. We had a crazy experience that morning because we had tested everything 3 times. I swear to God, people. We had tested everything 3 times that morning. And when the first speaker goes up to address the audience, there's 30,000 people sitting in this stadium. He goes up to address the audience and the microphone doesn't work. Right? And all we could determine was that somebody had accidentally, a chair foot could have smashed it. So the microphone didn't work. So I had to run up to where the string quartet was, take the wireless microphone that was hanging above them, and then run it up and put it on the podium. And I tapped on that microphone and you heard it go, right? And then at that moment, the entire stadium, all 30,000 people just erupted into applause, right? Just roared into applause that the microphone was now working and that we could get on with it, right? And it was one of those moments where you're doing something in front of 30,000 people. 30,000 people are watching you run up, grab this microphone, and change it out as quickly as possible, right? And then get out of the way so this thing can get happening. So that was the one time that I had an entire stadium of people applaud and yell and scream for me. And that was an amazing experience. Once you've had an entire stadium of people yell for you, it's kind of a weird... I mean, you've really set the bar high after that takes place, people. I'm not kidding. That was one of those great moments. Great moments in Matt Mettler history. Can't miss out on that, right? I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. I just want to thank everybody. Thank you so much for joining me here on the 5th episode of the Matt Mettler podcast. I really super appreciate all of you that are listening to this show. Please like, subscribe, share, and comment. I'm working on getting all the things, man. I'm going to make this thing a lot better, right? This is just the beginning. I've been watching a lot of YouTubers, and man, when I see how good all their stuff is, I realize I really got to step up my game once I get the video part of this thing happening. The audio part of this, I think I'm doing okay on. It's the video part that I got to get my game together, man. I got to get my stuff right. That's all coming in upcoming episodes. Oh, hey, another thing that's going to happen here in the not too distant future is I'm going to start posting these on my named channel. I actually have a channel on YouTube called Matt Mettler. I'd forgotten about that. I'd forgotten I had a channel called Matt Mettler. So I'm going to start posting these videos over on the Matt Mettler channel. That'll be coming very soon. All right. So thank you for listening, everybody. And I will talk to you on the next Matt Mettler podcast. The Matt Mettler podcast is a Matt Mettler production. Copyright 2019.